Stories of a provocative therapist from Norway doing outrageous things with his clients had circulated around NLP trainings that I had been attending. My first impression was that this guy was likely a narcissistic and dangerous person, until I met him by chance at a conference we were both speaking at in London. Could this really be the person I had heard about? Impressed by his presentation, I wanted to know more about him and his method. In this interview, I question his approach, and we find out the truth behind the crazy stories that have made him the provocative hypnotist and NLPer that he's become known as. What do you consider yourself, a therapist, a coach?
When people ask me, I essentially say to them that, look, all I ever do is help people relate to thoughts and feelings differently, because people are basically afraid of their own experience. I don't like the therapy framework because thoughts and feelings aren't really illnesses or diseases. So this whole idea of treating a thought or treating a feeling seems to me to be just like a misapplied metaphor, not very accurate. Mm-hmm. So I view it more as guiding or teaching, instruction, like psychoeducation.
Psychoeducation.
Yeah. Well, think about it. You know, you go to school, you learn basic math, you learn how to read, you learn a little bit about the world, hopefully, which is great. But there's very little attention on the inner world of thoughts and feelings and how to relate to it. Mm-hmm. So I think that a lot of the stuff, you know, where people trip themselves up is not because there's something wrong with them per se, but very often because they lack basic insights and basic skills into how to relate to their inner experience. So I view this a bit like education or training. You know, someone's coming in and saying, look, I struggle in these contexts, or I struggle with these thoughts and these feelings, and okay, we can do some experiments and hopefully help the person have some insights and some shifts.
Are you a trained therapist?
Well, I don't think there are any therapists per definition. Thomas Sauce nailed this, right, in 1961, where he said that mental illness is a myth, because you know, a brain can be sick, right? But a mind, how could a mind per definition be sick? Like a non-existent entity. So I mean, if someone has a brain disease like Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis or epilepsy or a brain tumor, you know, they're going to be seeing an oncologist or a neurologist and stuff like that. So in that context, the whole idea of treatment makes sense. But of course, the people who I see who come in and say that they suffer from a mental illness, the common denominator is that there hasn't been established any brain pathology. There's no evidence that there's anything wrong with their brain per se. There might be, but there's no evidence that there really is based upon the fact that they're suffering. So Thomas Sauce, who used to be a psychiatrist and the most famous critic of psychiatry in the world, he had a great analogy for this, where he said, look, if you go to a bar and you ask for a screwdriver, you're never going to get like a working tool thrown over the counter, because the bartender gets that it's a metaphor. You're getting a drink with vodka and orange juice. So the drink screwdriver is a metaphor and stands in relation to the screwdriver in the same way that a mental illness, a metaphorical diagnosis, stands in relation to an actual brain disease. So I don't think that that psychotherapists really do therapy at all.
So what do you think the mind is then?
Well, what do I think the mind is? So I mean, we can locate a brain, you know, by doing fMRI scans or look at brain activity. Mm-hmm. You could crack a skull open and see a brain. We can't really find a mind anywhere. I mean, if you try to find a mind...
so what does it mean to you when you think of a mind, or you say there's no mental illness, then what is the mind?
So my point kind of being that there's no thing like mind. There's no entity per se that you can find and localize. Mm-hmm. So a brain can be sick because it's an organ. You can find lesions or brain pathology, mm-hmm. but you can't really localize a mind as a thing, so it can't really be sick in a literal sense. You can talk about a relationship being sick, or you can talk about a sick song, but it's a metaphor. Now, when I don't think there's such a thing as a mind per se. I think there's minding, that there's subjectivity, there's the experience of being, there's intending, attending, there's thinking, feeling. There's a sense of subjectivity for sure. But I think to use the metaphor of illness, this idea that we're treating an illness and that there's this technique or intervention that works on this illness, I think is a bit like confusing the metaphorical drink with vodka and orange juice for a screwdriver, in a sense.
Okay, we jumped into this really deep, really fast. So let's back up just a little bit. Why do you use provocation to get results with your clients?
People are stuck when they come in and they kind of say, "Can you help me with something?" There usually is the case of a rigid way of thinking. They're locked onto a particular perspective. They tend to not have perspective on that, right? So to help people loosen things up a little bit, it's often useful to get some confusion, some humor, some drama, some laughter, some outrage, something to kind of jolt them a little bit, to get them off autopilot so that they can see something new. Confusion, I think, is very often a prerequisite for a new level of clarity.
What would you say to people who would say that what you're doing, provoking people who are mentally ill, which you don't believe in? What would you say to people who think that what you do, not just provocation itself, but what you do in general, is unethical?
Well, let me say this, though. Sometimes when I say to people that mental illness is a myth and that psychotherapy is a myth because you're not treating a disease, you might help educate, you might help someone develop certain skills or have certain insights or broaden their perspective taking, and these things are all useful. I'm not at all discounting that people suffer and that they might suffer enormously. But having having a broken heart, if your wife leaves you, or your relationship ends, someone might say, I have a broken heart, and I'm not doubting for a second that the person is in pain and that the person's suffering. And ironically, there is a medical diagnosis which is called broken heart syndrome, where people who have had traumatic experiences can actually develop damage to their heart, right? But unless there is evidence of something being wrong with the heart, they don't have a broken heart in a literal sense. It's a metaphorical sense. So a broken heart hurts, but it's not a disease. It's nothing to treat in that sense. So
if somebody's suffering that way, and you're doing something that's provocative with that person, which seems to most people that would be something that might push that person over the edge and do something to harm themselves. In most people's minds, there's instability in provocation. So what would you say to people who think that and would say that, this is unethical because you could actually harm somebody by doing some of these things, or doing something provocative with someone who's suffering and who feels sick?
In any legal system, you're supposed to have the presumption of innocence. And
interesting way to.
And I think that the same should be true with human beings as well. Meaning that unless there is medical tests showing that I actually have a disease, there should be the presumption of health. I think. So I treat people. I deal with people as if they're basically healthy, unless there is actual medical proof to suggest otherwise. And one of the things that I found so interesting when I started seeing clients is that psychiatry is very strong in Norway, that model of thinking. Mm-hmm. I would have so many clients come in and say, I have a mental illness, I have a chemical imbalance in the brain and these sorts of things. And I would ask them, but I see that you're suffering, but how do you know that you actually have an illness? And I would ask client after client after client, have you done any medical tests that confirmed a so-called chemical imbalance in the brain? And the answer was always no. I just found this astounding.
So you think that people are basically already pretty stable?
I think in us there is a basic intelligence that works to balance us out. So in spiritual traditions, we often call this, just consciousness or being itself, that its nature is innately peaceful. In the hypnosis and many more psychological approaches, there's the idea of an unconscious mind. But I think they both point to something in that, okay, if you cut your finger, if you scrape your knee, if you get a cold, there is some intelligence in us that is working to regulate us behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. And I think that the same thing is largely the case for thoughts and feelings as well. People often ask me, what should I do with this feeling? And I often say, as little as possible. I very often think that it's a lot of the things that we do to try to fix it. And there's a bit of research around, for example, rumination in the case of depression, for example, that the overthinking, the rumination is very often what keeps the thing going. So I would say that I think it's more unethical to impose a disease category on someone and treat and deal with them as if they are broken or sick, unless there is compelling evidence to suggest so. And I found it so useful with so many clients to kind of educate them and help them think about this and to help them dispel this identity that the fact that they're suffering with thoughts and feelings mean that there's necessarily something wrong with their brain, or that they're broken, or that they have an illness.
So tell me why you had a woman hallucinate dogs.
Oh, so I worked with a woman who was very self-conscious, very fearful and anxious about, will people perceive me as stupid if I make a mistake, or if I don't quite make sense. And I tried to work with her in this office actually, in the kind of regular way. And she had so much internal dialogue going on, and she was intellectualizing so much that I realized that I need to help make this real for her, in a sense. Mm-hmm. So I did something I called the Devil's Pact, which I borrowed from Jay Haley, and that is that I think I have something that's going to help you, but I need your commitment in advance that you're going to comply with my instructions, as long as they're not unethical or illegal or dangerous. Now, what I added is fattening. I've discovered with many women, illegal, immoral, don't care. Not fattening? Okay, I'm on board. It's fine. This is relief. So I took her to the mall in the city, and I said, look, so I'm going to do stuff, and your job is to imitate everything I do for the next day. I spent a few hours with her. So I went up to random women, and I just introduced myself and started a regular social conversation. And once I could see that the woman was comfortable with me, as in, okay, this guy seems sane, stable, I would lean down and pet a dog. Oh, he's so cute, which of course wasn't there. Mm. And then while the woman saw this and was kind of freaking out, I would stand back up and continue the previous conversation without blinking an eye. And this is kind of jarring to them because it's one thing if you started the conversation that way. They would go, but this guy's just nuts, I'm running away. But it's like, he seems sane. And what was that? And now he's sane again. And how should I respond? So I had her do this. And she was so embarrassed, you know, and then I would coach her on how she was thinking and making sense of it. And we went over to this other, I said, now I want you to walk over to people and pretend you're old friends. Just say, hi, Christine, how you been? You know, So I did it first, and then she did, hi, Christine, how are you? You know, and have you heard from Monica? And it turns out that both of those her name was Christine, and she had a very good friend called Monica. So it was like these random, you know, and she had her 2 kids with her. And then suddenly my client that I had instructed to do, she bent down and started to pet the invisible dog. And the mother was like, kids, run. She started to pull our kids. And the kids didn't sense any danger whatsoever. And then the final things we did, I had her go to a bakery and demand a steak. And to keep it up for 90 seconds, like when they say it's a bakery, to really complain about poor customer service. And we went to this they don't have video stores anymore, but they had back then. We were both atheists, so I said, I want you to convert someone to Christianity. So she went inside and looked at the guy and said, you look like a person who's done a lot of sinning in your life. Are you ready to accept Jesus Christ as your personal savior? And the guy got so shy and said, I'm not allowed to talk about that stuff at work. And she was like, there's no one here. And the final thing was I had her, this was inspired by Albert Ellis. I had her in Aker Brygge, Oslo, have a banana on a leash and walk the banana, you know, with a completely straight face. And people were, you know, taking photos and complimenting. And
so what was the overall outcome for her?
Well, the overall, it was very good. Because I would have her do these stunts, and then we would kind of coach her on her thinking, and could she deal with things, and what did that mean? And after doing, it worked a bit like a threshold pattern. Like it just became so ridiculous. And she had so many experiences in a row of, this person clearly thinks I'm nuts, but I'm dealing with it. I'm okay. So after that, as a sense of contrast, the things she did in regular life that she used to anxietize about now was way easier to deal with.
And you bring an anorexic woman to a restaurant, you hire actors.
Yes.
Sounds pretty dramatic. What happened?
Well, let me offer a kind of rationale behind this too, because I used to teach self-defense for many years. I had my own self-defense school, in a sense. And I trained with a Canadian guy called Tony Blower, who used to do something he called panic attacks. And what they would do is to have like plexiglass helmets and light gloves and protective gear. And instead of like sparring or choreography, we would create scenarios. So, you know, you're standing by the bus stop, this guy's a drug addict, he goes over, you know, and you kind of play out the verbal dialogue, the ambush, the sucker punch, the whole thing. And what I discovered when doing this is that I would have so many people who could have like a decade of martial arts, you know, black belts, who would do this, and they would all go to shit. Like they'd lose all their skills because they had the adrenaline dump. And of course, it's a simulation, it's fake. But people tended to respond as if it was real. And what I kind of concluded from that was that to be able to have access to your skills in a really high-stress, high-adrenaline situation, it makes sense to at least practice some of the time in that sort of state. Because what I think happens very often in self-defense training is that people practice these theoretical techniques often in a very choreographed, low-key environment where people are cooperating, and then one day you have to deal with a real psychopath, and the shock, the trauma, the adrenaline, the tunnel vision, the loss of fine motor skills, the bridge between the state you're in and the state you were in training might be so large that there's not necessarily a bridge. So I don't think this completely applies to change work, but there was a guy called Eugene Gendlin in the 70s. He wrote a book called Focusing. And instead of asking the question, and I am answering the question, I'm just taking a little detour, but instead of asking the question like which therapists or therapies work the best, he asked who succeeds in therapy. And one of the things he discovered was that the people who were good at having a voluntary felt sense of the issue while in the office had way better odds than the people who couldn't quite connect with their experience. So in the case of this anorectic, for example, who I'll tell you quickly the story, because she had been to, this was in 2002, my first eating disorder case. She was 172 centimeters high, 39 kilograms. Just skin and bones, and she'd been to been to experts for 7 years, various clinics, because her parents had some money. I spoke to her father, and I agreed to work with her, and I said she's mine for a week, essentially, and I'm going to try stuff. And I got this thing from Ross Jeffries, out of all people. He had this crappy sketch artist thing for seduction. So I had two people I know, two friends, come by who were kind of artists and pretend to make this portrait of her because she was so beautiful. And she was like, looking and, kind of making. And at the end, the guy comes over and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but your beauty has inspired, art in me." And he kind of bows and he puts this crappy sketch figure of Auschwitz 1944 and, like this. And I got the chef to serve her this big steak, and I had people kind of play pranks on her. And the first thing I did when she went into my office was one of my grandmothers had just died, and I had a lot of material from the funeral service, and I dressed up in kind of the black suit, and I just started talking about death immediately, and had she made arrangements for her body after death, cremation or burial, or what do you think about these brochures, and let's take a look at various coffins that you could. In the beginning, she just laughed and had this arrogant, but I kept it up. And after a while, she started crying, and I knew that I'd kind of penetrated through that outer layer. It just pushed all her buttons. She was used to dominating her parents and family members with this eating disorder.
It's a control issue?
A control thing.
So
yeah.
How did the actors playing pranks on her in the restaurant, how did that?
Well, I was the first therapist who didn't accept the idea that she had an illness. And who weren't tiptoeing around her, and was just being brutally honest and essentially holding her accountable for the way she was behaving.
You weren't concerned that this might push her in a very dark place?
Well, after the crappy sketch artist thing, she got so insulted, and she said, "That's unfair, and you clearly know people in the city." And I said, "Fine, you up for a challenge?" So we drove to Drummond, and we hit the main streets. And I went up to people and I said, "Hi," and I had her next to me. I said, "Hi, my name is Peter. I'm from the Norwegian Anorexia Association. We're serving the general public so that anorectics can see how other people think about things. This woman here thinks about losing another 20 pounds. What do you think about that?" And of course, people would be horrified, right? So the first guy was horrified. The second guy was like, "Oh, I think she's really beautiful and whatever she wants to do." And she kind of perked up and she went, it's Caroline 1, Jørgen 1. We were like in the game. And it ended up being 19-1 to me. And she was kind of dejected. But one thing I picked up, for example, from her father, because she was kind of an upper class type girl, right? So So that she really disliked and felt contempt for drug addicts. So I had a good friend of mine named Joe. I said, Joe, I need a favor. When she arrives at the train station here in Kongsberg for me to pick her up, I want you to dress up as a drug addict and wait behind the hotel. And when you see her, go up to her and ask, kind of ask her if she has something or wants something. And he was dirty and, and her response had been like, what? Do I look like that? Like, oh, come on, you're one of us. And and she was so disgusted by someone viewing her that way. So when I went to pick her up, she was like, has Peter from the Anorexia Association been here today? And I was like, what are you talking about? Well, this guy. So look at you. You fucking look like a drug addict. Look at these arms. You're at the train station. What the fuck do you expect? Don't accuse me of lying. And she was like, oh, sorry. And we drove, and I was trying not to burst out laughing. Right? I said, by the way, how did this guy look? And she said, oh, he really hit rock bottom. When I went to my friend later to talk to him, he was, by the way, this other friend and his uncle drove by the kind of alley street next to the hotel. And they saw my friend Joe, and they said, Joe, is that you? He tried to kind of hide, and he was like, it's not what it looks like. I'm just doing a favor for. But his mother was a nurse, and she said that. She said, what are you doing? You can't do stuff like this. This is dangerous. You might push her over the edge. And my response was, yes, maybe. But she's been to experts for 7 years, and she's not changing, and she may... what about being in that funeral and knowing in your heart of hearts that, I could have done something. I could have called her out. I could have tried something to awaken her.
So you played a bunch of pranks on her. You sort of discombobulated her. And then what was the end result?
Well, one of the things that we also did was to kind of discover what she got out of doing this, playing the anorexia game. And it was a way to feel significant and a way to try to be in control, a way of getting excitement and feeling that she mastered something.
So did she start eating again and gain some weight?
Well, yeah. And she had this big thing about being special. And I kind of helped her to see that being obsessed with being special is one of the most common things out there. And we worked on other ways of kind of achieving a sense of mastery and significance, and that could work better than what she was doing with the anorexia game. This was in 2002. I spoke to her last in 2010. She had a normal weight, no longer had fixations around food. So she did marvelously. Nice. Really interesting thing too is she went back to Germany. She lived in Berlin. And she spoke to therapists, and they would go, what's happened to you? Who's helped you? What doctor, what psychologist? No, it was this NLP guy. And the uniform response was, don't want to hear it. Like, not part of our tribe. Don't want the information.
You really offered to kill one of your clients, and was that client suicidal?
Well, this wasn't actually a client. This was a very close friend who I was dating, and who ended up being my wife, actually, who is my wife today. So she's okay with me sharing that. No, what had happened was that she had been in an accident, and she had been in a coma, and she developed this delusion, in a sense, that she was dead, and that there was no point in eating or doing anything because she was dead. And I was concerned, because I kind of thought that if she doesn't snap out of this, she might be getting weird drugs and, what have you. I wanted to test the reality of her beliefs. So I said, I have a friend who works in the media who's very curious about this person who's dead, but who can still have a boyfriend and do exercises, and, is wondering if you would be willing to do an interview, because maybe that could help other people who are afraid of being dead that maybe that could. And she said, yeah, as long as it was treated seriously, I would be willing to do it. So I thought, shit, she's really into. And the next time I came back, I said, look, I've always had a fantasy of killing someone, but I can't do that for ethical reasons. But I thought, since you're already dead, what if I killed you? And she considered it, and she said, okay. And how are we going to do it? Well, a knife, but not a cheap knife, like a good. So we arranged the time. This was at a rehabilitation home called Sykehus. I had my leather jacket. I had a big knife on the inside of my. Went into her room, grabbed her, put the knife on her throat, and played the parts. And at that point, she had a pretty strong emotional response, and said, no, don't do it. And until then, one of the kind of convincers that she was dead was that she didn't really feel anything. She didn't really feel her usual. And after that, she was in a state of confusion, trying to make sense of things. So I called a good friend of mine called Tony, who had been in a car accident. And we made up, we kind of lied to her, but I said my good friend Ronnie experienced something similar. He had that belief too after an accident. Would you be willing to talk to him? And she said yes, and Ronnie called her. And I kind of coached him on how to pace and lead, use her words and kind of lead her out of it. And after that conversation, there was no more talk about being dead. It was this very dramatic change.
You put the knife to her throat. She suddenly experiences feelings.
Right.
And that created some confusion. And then your friend Ronnie kind of helped her sort that out.
Helped her sort out, yeah.
And then she's like, I got to marry this guy and have kids with him.
Well, not necessarily that fast.
Yeah, I know.
But the really interesting thing too is that afterwards, when Ronnie and I have told people the story of what we did, people who have training in the health field, for the most part, are appalled, like horrified by it.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think these people, I mean, I thought of you as a dangerous person just from hearing the rumors about you.
Right.
I would imagine people in the mental health field, do they think you're a dangerous person when they hear about these things?
Well, probably, but civilians, people who don't have that sort of training, they loved it. They saw it as a declaration of love. And my wife, when we told her, a few months later, she was like, I'm so happy that you guys cared so much that you were willing to do that for me.
Are you a dangerous person?
Behind the wheel of a car sometimes. Depends on the context. I don't think so. I think it's a bit like discussing politics, and I'm not intending to go into a political discussion, but it's a bit like if someone asks like, well, should we do this? Should we do that? Well, maybe we should clarify first, for example, what role should the state have in people's life, for example? There is fundamental, and I think in terms of dangerousness, it's as I said previously, I think that the economist Thomas Sowell used to say that there's few solutions in life. There's trade-offs. There's sweet points. And of course there's risk, but I think it's more dangerous and more unethical to kind of impose a disease category without compelling evidence than there is to treat someone as if they're basically healthy. Because these are voluntary interactions. They're not forced. I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't have power over anyone. These are people who have sought me out because they have not succeeded in the traditional therapy system.
So speaking of that, why should someone come to you for help?
Well,
there's lots of options out there, right?
There's a lot of options out there. So what I say to people is I say to people, look, I view most of psychological suffering as a psychological illusion of sorts. Not meaning not real, but not quite what you think it is. So this is the analogy I use. I say, look, I have some friends who are magicians and mentalists, and when they show new tricks, I feel like an idiot because I fall for the tricks every time. On one hand, I know that what I'm seeing isn't real because they're magicians, but it feels real. And everything I do to try to solve it usually makes me more prone to get sucked into it because all my solutions are based upon misunderstanding the mechanism to begin with. I view these things that people call phobias and obsessions and compulsions and anxieties a bit like psychological magic tricks in a sense. We forget that we think. We misunderstand our own experience. So I say to people, don't view this as therapy, but view this as the opportunity to join a magician backstage and have the opportunity to kind of uncover how the trick works. Because a bit like with regular magic, as soon as you kind of see the trick, it's like, oh, is that how it works? So for people who hear that and who go, maybe I am misunderstanding my own experience, and maybe I am basically healthy, and maybe I could learn some new. If people resonate with that, and that feels right, that might be an inclination that this way of working is a good match. And if people don't like that, they can do something else.
What do you think you contribute to self-help that no one else is contributing?
Oh, no one else is a very ambitious. I don't know if I would go that far and say that I'm doing things that no one else. But one thing that I do think that I kind of is I work with people without imposing the therapy treatment frame. And I teach something I call the psychological illusion model, which is based upon this idea that we basically fall for some basic psychological illusions. And it's a kind of educational approach, and it kind of combines Western approaches such as Neuro Linguistic Programming and understanding hypnosis with the more non-dual meditation-based stuff of seeing through the illusory nature of the self and stuff like that. And I think combining those, I'm not saying that no one else is doing that, but relatively few people, I think, are combining Eastern and Western approaches in that way. So that I think is something I kind of bring to the table.
So you have a bit of a reputation in the field of hypnosis and NLP, and I do know for a fact that sometimes that reputation is as kind of a sinister or evil person or unethical person. When you meet people who sort of have that impression of you and they kind of get to know you a little bit, what is their response to you?
The most common one is they say, "You're actually a pretty nice guy." and that's the thing about, if you read the books I've written, what a lot of people don't know is that most of the people, not all of them, but most of them were laughing throughout these interactions. We had good rapport. It was bantering. There was humor. There were jokes. There were... So that's the thing about just reading a transcript, is that people might say, oh, look at... That's a mean thing to say. But it's hard to know that without knowing the context and without knowing the other person's response. And also remember this, that many of these people were, I started my career intentionally having an impossibles practice. I would advertise looking for people who had not succeeded in therapy and offer them a no change, no pay policy, which is kind of nuts. I was 21 years old. It's a great way to go broke. But it's also a great way you're putting yourself in a situation where you may learn stuff. A lot of these people were kind of desperate and they had not succeeded. And this is a funny thing if you look at the therapy field, because we are often asking of our clients to experiment, to be flexible, to think in new ways, to take chances. But the very same therapists often are extremely conformist and orthodox and abide by these bureaucratic guidelines. And I think that's often a contradiction.
So I have to say I was one of those people. When I heard stories about you, I thought, wow, this guy is way out there. And it kind of concerned me that someone was out there doing some of these rather crazy things and sounded dangerous. And then I'm in London giving a talk, and then I find out you're giving a talk at the same conference. And I thought, well, I want to go check this guy out. And I watched your presentation. I was really impressed. You talked about a lot of things that I've studied and gone into, and your solutions were, I found them right away practical and could be immediately used. And then we talked a little bit after that, and I was pleasantly surprised that you are a nice guy and very reasonable and very clear-minded, and didn't find anything dangerous or unethical about anything that you were teaching. So it was good for me to question the impression that I had of someone and get to know you. And I feel like you've opened my mind about the mind, and your perspective really challenges me. That's a good thing, and it helps me to expand the way that I think about things, and probably affects the way that I now do coaching and think about the mental technologies. I really appreciate your perspective, and that's what brought me to Norway. And so I really want to thank you for sitting down with me and having this chat, and having a very unconventional way of going about these things so that you can maybe solve problems that seem unsolvable.
I'm honored. Let me add this too, that a lot of the stories are from the first book, Provocative Hypnosis, in 2008. That's me in my 20s. And I had a second book, which was me in my 30s. Now I'm in my, I'm 46. So I don't do many of those extreme stunts anymore, because my style has kind of changed. So there is an element to that as well. But as one guy said, with any book, it's the author starts the book, but it's always the reader who finishes it and creates the story in their own mind of what it means. I think it's the same with interventions too. People, it's not what we say, it's what the client hears, it's what they discover that really is the main thing.